Hello, creative! In this video, I'd like to invite you to join me in painting this peaceful marina scene in watercolor. We'll be working with soft reflections, gentle ripples, light color, and all those small details that make water such a fascinating subject to paint. So let's paint together. Before I start painting, I almost always make a few small studies. Usually, one is monochrome, where I'm simply exploring the relationship between light and shadow. The second is a color sketch, where I start thinking about the mood, the palette, and how the colors might work together. They more like anchors. They help me understand the scene before I commit it to a larger sheet of paper. So before I wet the paper, there is one small thing I like to do. I gently lift some of the graphite with a kneaded eraser. Not because I want to remove the drawing completely, but because watercolor leaves cleanliness, and strong pencil lines can sometimes become more visible than I'd like once the paint goes on. A kneaded eraser is perfect for this because it doesn't damage the surface of the paper. It simply softens the graphite without disturbing the texture. For this painting, I'm using a wash brush to wet the surface evenly. Sometimes I use a spray bottle instead, especially when I want a lighter, more controlled amount of moisture. Both methods work perfectly well. The important thing is simply making sure the paper is evenly prepared before the first wash. When the paper is absorbing the water, I start mixing my colors on the palette. For this first layer, all my mixtures are what we talked about earlier as a tea consistency. They're very diluted, very transparent, and full of water. And at this stage, I'm not trying to create strong color or contrast. I'm simply establishing the atmosphere of the painting. I'm starting with the lightest colors in the painting. The sky, the soft glow near the horizon, and the first hints of color in the water. Everything is still very diluted, very transparent, and I'm not worrying about details in this stage. One thing I'm paying attention to here is moisture. The paper is still damp enough to help the colors blend naturally, but not so wet that I completely lose control of them. For the horizon area, I'm using a very soft, warm mixture. I want that gentle evening light to sit between the cooler blues above and below it. Even though this section looks simple, it plays an important role later because it helps create depth and atmosphere. As I move into the sky, I'm gradually introducing stronger blues. Notice that I'm not trying to cover everything with one heavy layer. Watercolor is usually built step by step, and I prefer to let the painting develop gradually. And if I work too quickly, the colors can merge into each other and lose some of the softness I'm looking for. Once a middle area has settled and absorbed some of the moisture, I can return with a richer blue and begin strengthening the upper part of the sky. This second layer creates more contrast and helps draw the eye toward the light near the horizon. I'm only building the foundation. most of the details, reflection, and darker whiles will come later. Before adding any color, I lightly wet this area because I want these shapes to stay soft and sit far back in the painting. The first touch of paint is always a little test. It tells me more about the moisture of the paper than any visual check can. For a distant landscape, that softness actually works in my favor. Faraway trees, hills, boats, and shoreline details rarely need sharp edges. A slight blur helps create depth and atmosphere. At that stage, I can suggest the distant hills and the neighboring boats without losing that feeling of distance that I'm looking for. So, water. At this stage, actually, I'm not painting individual waves. Instead, I'm creating an impression of movement by changing the direction and width of my brush strokes. Notice how the marks become thinner, lighter, and more delicate as they approach the horizon. This helps create depth and keeps the water feeling expansive rather than flat. Using the same soft brush, I gradually darken my mixture and begin strengthening selected areas. And I'm not covering everything evenly. Instead, I'm placing darker passages here and there, allowing plenty of the previous wash to remain visible. The same principle still applies. The closer the water is to the viewer, the darker and more saturated it becomes. As I move toward the horizon, there is progressively more water and less pigment in my brush. Once this layer is in place, I let it rest for a while. I'm waiting for a paper to move from wet to damp. And this is one of my favorite moments because it gives me time to mix the next color mixture, which is much richer and darker. When the surface reaches the damp stage, I switch to a firmer synthetic brush. This allows me to begin adding the darker shapes that sit within the waves, the shadowed troughs and deeper pockets of water between the highlights. These darker accents are what start giving the water volume and structure. And sometimes I simply stand up and look from distance. Other times I squint my eyes slightly. Squinting removes a lot of unnecessary detail and lets me see the main value pattern more clearly. It's simple habit, but it makes it much easier to judge whether the water still feels balanced. Rather than filling the marina with a lot of boats, I focus on a single main yacht. One carefully placed boat is usually enough to tell the story without overfilming the viewer, because too many objects would compete for attention, while I want the water in the foreground to remain the true focal point of the painting. This is also where reflections start to appear. Reflections in water are rarely exact copies of the objects about them. I usually paint them slightly longer than the actual object and allow them to vary in color and intensity. These elongated vertical shapes help create the visual illusion of water and make the scene feel calm and reflective. You'll notice that I often jump from one area of the painting to another. This isn't random. If I already have a perfect color mixed on my palette, I'll use it wherever it belongs. Perhaps on distant masts, shoreline accent, or a reflection. Working this way helps keep color harmony throughout the painting. For the masts, I switch to a rigger brush or liner brush. To achieve long, confident lines, I use a grip I learned from Peter Campos. By holding the brush farther back and allowing the whole arm to move, it becomes much easier to paint straight vertical lines. As the painting develops, the brush begins traveling across the entry surface. At this point, I'm placing visual cues rather than detailed descriptions. A few mast lines, a suggestion of rigging, some darker shapes along the shoreline, a small cluster of rocks. All of these elements help the viewer recognize the scene without needing every detail to be painted. This may look a little chaotic, but there is a purpose behind it. The middle ground should support the composition, not dominate it. Too much detail here would distract from the atmosphere and from the water in foreground. The reflections follow the same principle. Using fluid vertical strokes, I pull color downward from the objects above. I don't try to control every mark. In fact, some of the most convincing reflections come from allowing the brush to wander slightly, leaving unexpected wiggles and irregularities behind. Water is constantly moving, and those small imperfections help create a more natural effect than perfectly straight lines ever could. The setting sun behind the scene catches the edges of these wooden structures, and I don't want to lose that subtle glow. Once the light areas are established, I gradually deepen the shadow side of each post. This simple contrast between warm light and cool shadow helps the posts feel solid and anchored within the scene. This is also a good moment to observe perspective. Along the horizon, the tops of the posts sit on the same visual level, reinforcing the calm geometry of the marina. However, it is the reflections that truly reveal the perspective of the scene. As the posts move farther away from the viewer, their reflection becomes shorter and less dominant. This subtle change suggests a vanishing point beyond the picture and helps create the illusion of depth across the water surface. Reflections are rarely perfect mirrors. I put them downward with relaxed vertical strokes, allowing slight irregularities to appear. Those small variations mimic the movement of water and prevent the reflections from looking mechanical. Next come the ropes connecting the posts. I suggest their presence with broken, softened marks that disappear and reappear across the water. At this stage, every element is serving two purposes at once, describing the marina and strengthening the scene of depth. The posts, ropes, and reflection work together to guide the eye through the painting, while still allowing the foreground water to remain the true protagonist of the composition. Using a darker, more concentrated mixture, I start introducing small accents around the boats, moorings, and distance structures. These touches create focal points and help separate shapes that would otherwise merge together. As the painting develops, I'm constantly asking myself one question. Does this detail help the painting, or it's simply information? If a mark strengthens depth, atmosphere, or visual flow, it stays. If it merely explains an object, it is usually unnecessary. The true subject of this painting is still the water in the foreground. Every dark accent, every mast, every rope, and every reflection exists to support the main character rather than compete with it. The painting is now entering its final stage. At this point, all major shapes have already been established. The composition works, the depth is in place, and the main tonal structure has been resolved. The goal is no longer to add information. The goal is to restore light. Throughout the painting process, we gradually lose some of the sparkle that existed in the early washes. Layer after layer, we gain structure and atmosphere, but we also sacrifice a little freshness. And this final touch helps bring that freshness back. I using Schmincke Titanium White. Yes, it's watercolor paint, not gouache. And I begin placing a small numbers of highlights across the painting. Thank you for joining me today. I hope you've enjoyed this workshop. Keep painting, stay curious, and I'll see you in the next one. Happy painting!